On this last day that we're together, if you can pass your good energy on to others, I am convinced we will win. And we will have the president we all dream of. A president who will be your president.
This wave of social rebellion, this wave of Polish patriots, we will not be stopped by anything. Not propaganda, not lies. Because we are going to victory.
That's the choice facing voters in Poland when they go to the polls Sunday to elect a new president. Rafal Trzaskowski, Warsaw's centrist mayor and the government's preferred candidate, goes head-to-head with nationalist historian Karol Nawrocki, who's supported by the right-wing Law and Justice Party. Friday was the final day of campaigning. The latest opinion polls show a razor-thin margin between the candidates. Some analysts are calling the presidential runoff a clash of civilizations. A win for Trzaskowski would be a boost for the government's reform agenda, while Nawrocki would become a roadblock to legislation. Nawrocki is a big admirer of Donald Trump and wants a close alliance between Washington and Warsaw. Trump threw his full support behind Nawrocki during a meeting at the Oval Office. US conservatives also backed him at this week's CPAC event in Poland.
That is what we need Poland to do now. We need you to elect the right leader. You will be the leaders that will turn Europe back to conservative values. If you elected a leader that will work with President Donald J. Trump, the Polish people will have an ally strong that will ensure that you will be able to fight off enemies that do not share your values.
Grzymala-Busse is a professor of international studies at Stanford University, California. One area of her expertise is democratic backsliding in post-communist Eastern Europe. Welcome. You wrote in a recent article, the future of Polish democracy is at stake Sunday. The presidency is largely a figurehead position. So why does this election matter so much this time?
Well, the president has very few duties. One of them is to veto legislation. And so what the current president has done, he's affiliated with PiS and has consistently basically stymied judiciary reforms. That was really sort of the linchpin of the democratic backsliding that took place under the PiS administration. And attempts to undo this kind of backsliding were really stymied by Duda, the current president, who basically vetoed one piece of legislation after another. Another way in which democratic reforms depend on the election of the president is really the stance towards the European Union. The former administration has consistently taken a stance that Polish law subsumes European law and has acted against EU directives.
Now, neither Trzaskowski nor Nawrocki got anywhere close to a majority in the first round. How divided are Polish voters right now?
Well, the election is very close run. Trzaskowski and Nawrocki are running neck and neck. Trzaskowski has a slight advantage, but what's been really surprising to many observers is that there have been several scandals that have emerged about Nawrocki without really touching his support. There was a scandal about him procuring prostitutes, another one about him taking advantage of an old man for whom he was a legal guardian, but they seem to do nothing about his support. And I think this is really sort of, indicative of just how firmly entrenched some of the voters are.
At the same time, research shows a distrust of democratic institutions in Poland, the government, the courts, public media. Why is that?
A lot of that distrust is partisan. So, for example, the supporters of the former PiS government view the judiciary as doing very well. The supporters of the Platforma, certainly the current government, see it as doing very poorly because they view it as politicized by the previous government. So much as in the United States and in many other Western democracies, partisan connections really sort of cast a very strong influence on how people perceive how institutions are functioning.
And what about younger Poles? Many of them came of age during the years of far-right populist rule. How has that shaped their political outlook, and are they voting differently from older generations?
Younger voters are a really interesting group because on one hand, their turnout and their support were the reason why the current reformist government won office in 2023. So they're absolutely important to that, especially younger women who are incensed by the sort of anti-abortion stances of the peace government. Younger men, on the other hand, are split. And so many of them support sort of far-right formations like Confederacja, which are very much not sort of, aligned with this new reformist government. So I think overall, young people very much support the reforms. But there's a strong contingent that is kind of leaning towards far-right parties. Again, much as has been happening all across Europe.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Hungary's Viktor Orban is supporting Nawrocki. So is Romania's George Simeon. How closely connected are these nationalist populist forces in Europe?
I think of them as working in parallel tracks. I think they have the same autocratic commitments. They attempt to implement the same autocratic template in many cases. They go after the judiciary, they go after the media, they go after civil society and universities. But the level of coordination and actual mutual help is not as significant as we might think. Partly because a lot of these movements are highly nationalistic and they really prize sovereignty. And so they risk a backlash if they're seen as too cosmopolitan or too pan-Europeanist.
And what about US influence? We just saw CPAC, a US conservative conference, hold an event in Poland just days before an election. Does that overstep the line when it comes to outside meddling?
It certainly represents a departure from former U.S. policy, where the United States in times past would support free elections. It would speak out generally about the importance of voting and the importance of the democratic process, without ever sort of pointing out for whom to vote. This administration, in this respect, as in so many others, is very different and is willing to break those norms.
Okay. How closely would you say then Nawrocki and his right-wing allies are looking at Donald Trump and his sidestepping of constitutional controls?
Right. Well, so Nawrocki certainly aligns himself very much with Trump. As, we pointed out earlier in the segment, he met with Trump very briefly. They had a sort of brief photo op. He tried to make huge political hay out of this in Poland. He claims to be very closely aligned with the United States and will be able to bring American support to Poland. But the truth is that, a lot of people have grown very skeptical about President Trump and his support of anyone outside of himself. And so even within Poland, President Trump has gone from 80% popular support to less than 30% in the most recent public opinion poll. So this is not likely to have some kind of an overbearing impact or to convince many voters who might be on the fence to vote for Nawrocki.
Anna, when it comes to your expertise, how important is the EU in constraining democratic backsliding in Poland?
Unfortunately, I think as we've already seen with Hungary, with Romania, with Poland, with Slovakia, there's really only so much that the EU can do. And so when we had the new government come into power in 2023, the European Union released 100 billion of funding that it had basically held in reserve because of the violations of the rule of law in Poland. But those violations still took place. Hungary is now a fully fledged autocracy within the European Union, and there's almost nothing that the European Union could have done at this point, or could do at this point, to really prevent the situation from worsening. So, part of that has to do with the sort of the intricacies of Article 7. Part of this has to do with the fact that this wasn't sort of nipped in the bud much earlier. But I don't think the EU can do so much to promote democracy in these countries as we would like it to.
And just lastly, on the health of democracy, is there a danger that this deep divide that we talked about between Poland's centrist and populist forces becomes a permanent feature of politics in Poland?
I think Polish politics are polarized, but there's sort of two aspects to this. On the one hand, yes, there's absolutely a difference in worldview between the supporters of the current government and the previous government. There's no question about that. It's the difference between traditionalism and cosmopolitanism, between populism and liberalism. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is that almost all parties in Poland are on the conservative end of the spectrum. They're center-right, they're populist right, or they're far-right, but there are very few parties that are on the left. And so in a weird way, this is a polarized system, but within a relatively narrow ideological spectrum.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. Great talking to you tonight, Anna Grzymala-Busse. Thank you for your expertise.
Thank you.
Well, for more on this, let's bring in our Brussels bureau chief, Alexandra von Nahmen, who is in the Polish capital, Warsaw, to cover the presidential election. Alexandra, great to see you as always. So Polish politics has been facing, let's call it a sort of a stalemate caused by the president blocking the Tusk government's attempts to change legislation. So what's at stake in this weekend's vote then?
Well, the stakes are really high in this very tight vote this weekend, and the worst case scenario could be that Poland may be facing a deep political crisis. You were right mentioning the incumbent president, Andrzej Duda, has been accused of blocking important legislations put forward by the center-right government, and members of this government were saying that the president is the main obstacle when it comes to putting Poland back on track when it comes to the rule of law, because he has a big say in the foreign policy, but also when it comes to the judicial system. So if the incumbent president is going to be succeeded by the national conservative candidate Karol Nawrocki, then this blockade is likely to continue, and that could result in a collapse of the government. The other scenario is, of course, when we will see if that happens, if the liberal candidate, Mr. Trzaskowski, is going to win the election. He is supported by the government, and that could be indeed a turning point for Poland, make it easier for the government to govern and to make good on the promises that they made on the campaign trail.
Now, Alexandra, we've just mentioned it there. You've mentioned it. The polls are indicating an incredibly tight race. So if there's no party with, say, a major majority, would this again impact decision-making, or what could happen then?
Well, I think that, of course, we can expect one of the candidates to win on Sunday, with the first results to be expected on Monday. But the big question will be whether this candidate, this new president, will be able to unite the whole nation behind him and support the government, or rally them to support his position. And, of course, the big question here is how narrow the victory will be, because this is such a neck-and-neck race, and whether the other camp will be willing to accept the other camp's victory and concede. And many people that I've been speaking with are concerned after a very, what they call a brutal and a campaign full of scandals and accusations and verbal attacks. So they are saying they're hoping that the outcome of this vote will be accepted by everyone here in Poland.
Now, Alexandra, there's been a lot of interest in this race across Europe, because, of course, it's between, you mentioned it, a liberal pro-European candidate and then a nationalist conservative. So what impact would a victory have by either candidate have on, say, Poland's standing in the European Union?
Well, the Liberal mayor of Warsaw, Rafal Trzaskowski, who is the liberal candidate supported by the government, he is a pro-European politician. He wants a deeper European integration. He wants to forge deeper ties with France and Germany. He wants more climate action. But his opponent, the national conservative historian, Mr. Nawrocki, he is very skeptical and critical of what he calls bureaucracy in Brussels. He says he wants to save Poland from this dictate from Brussels. So I think that if he is going to win, then it will be much more difficult for the government to continue with their pro-European course.
Great to have that update and analysis there, Alexandra. DW's Brussels bureau chief, Alexandra von Nahmen, joining us from the Polish capital, Warsaw. Thanks.